Margaret Patrick. Meet Ruth Eisenberg. Ruth Eisenberg and Margaret Patrick played the piano together for several years. They gave concerts in the United States and in Canada, and they were often on TV. They were famous. Why were they famous? They played the piano well, but they were not famous because they played well. They were famous because Mrs. Eisenberg played the piano with only her right hand, and Mrs. Patrick played the piano with only her left hand. They sat next to each other and played the piano together. Mrs. Eisenberg played one part of the music, and Mrs. Patrick played the other part. Mrs. Eisenberg and Mrs. Patrick didn't always play the piano with only one hand. When they were younger, they played with two hands. Mrs. Patrick was a piano teacher. She taught hundreds of students. She taught her own children, too. Then, when she was 69 years old, Mrs. Patrick had a stroke. She couldn't move or speak. Gradually, she got better, but her right side was still very weak. She couldn't play the piano anymore. She was very sad. Playing the piano was Mrs. Eisenberg's hobby. She often played 5 or 6 hours a day. Then, when she was 80 years old, she too had a stroke. She couldn't move the left side of her body, so she couldn't play the piano anymore. She was very sad. A few months after her stroke, Mrs. Eisenberg went to a senior citizens center. There were a lot of activities at the center, and Mrs. Eisenberg wanted to keep busy. Mrs. Patrick wanted to keep busy too. A few weeks later, she went to the same center. The director was showing her around the center when Mrs. Patrick saw a piano. She looked sadly at the piano. "Is anything wrong?" the director asked. "No," Mrs. Patrick answered. "The piano brings back memories. Before my stroke, I played the piano." The director looked at Mrs. Patrick's weak right hand and said, "Wait here. I'll be right back." A few minutes later, the director came back with Mrs. Eisenberg. "Margaret Patrick," the director said, "meet Ruth Eisenberg. Before her stroke, she played the piano too. She has a good right hand, and you have a good left hand. I think you two can do something wonderful together." "Do you know Chopin's Waltz in D-flat?" Mrs. Eisenberg asked Mrs. Patrick. "Yes," Mrs. Patrick answered. The two women sat down at the piano and began to play. Mrs. Eisenberg used only her right hand, and Mrs. Patrick used only her left hand. The music sounded good. The women discovered that they loved the same music. Together, they began to play the music they loved. They were not sad anymore. Mrs. Patrick said, "Sometimes God closes a door and then opens a window. I lost my music, but I found Ruth. Now I have my music again. I have my friend Ruth, too.